Hello and welcome, friends. I hope everybody's had a great day so far. If you are new here, welcome. And if you're back, welcome back. I greatly appreciate all of the ongoing support. This is my channel, Dragonsjewel Creative Gems, and I'm Tegan, and I'm just gonna get all that wonderful YouTubey stuff out of the way first. If you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, please consider doing so, just down below. If you like the content you see, don't forget to give a like. And of course, any love, comments, suggestions, all those wonderful things, there's a comment section down there as well for all of that. Today we are diving back into the Ghostly Echoes series. We had been working our way through British Columbia, so now we are going east. We're skipping over Alberta because we already did that one, and we are diving into the ghost stories of Saskatchewan. So I hope you guys enjoy these next few spooky tales. This story takes place in Regina, Saskatchewan, an unlucky house. When Joel Scott moved into the charming two-story house on Regina's College Avenue, he was a hopeful young newlywed. It was the spring of 1976. In May of 1977, Joel moved out, with his 16-month-old marriage in crumbling ruins. A sad story, but not so unusual, unless you take into account that Joel claimed the house he had and his wife lived in contributed to the destruction of the relationship, and that perhaps his marriage wasn't the building's first victim. This was a house with a morbid history, and in his 1-year stay, Joel was to discover much about it. The day the Scotts moved in, there was a small foreshadow of things to come. As they made trip after trip through the front door with their belongings, Joel noticed something lying by the side of the house. It turned out to be a rubber sink stopper. He assumed it must have fallen from the second-story bathroom window, and on his next trip into the house, replaced it on the counter by the sink. A few minutes later, the stopper was again on the ground outside the house. Joel believed his wife must have been playing a prank. Once more, he returned the stopper to the sink, this time closing the bathroom window for good measure. The remainder of the afternoon was spent indoors as the newlyweds busily arranged furniture and personal belongings in their new home. Late in the day, Joel stepped outside for some fresh air and was a little annoyed to find the bathroom sink stopper in the grass beside the house for the third time. Joel made a comment to his wife, but she claimed to know nothing about the wandering rubber stopper. As a curious but unimportant event in the midst of a hectic day, the incident was, for a time, forgotten. The Scotts settled comfortably into their new home, but before long they were confronted with other mysteries. Their sleep would often be interrupted by the sound of breaking glass, but when Joel investigated the main floor, expecting to confront vandals, he found nothing. When the couple's backs were turned, a 30-pound potted plant that was in the living room would reposition itself in the dining room, approximately 8 feet away. Smaller items would move on their own as well, sometimes disappearing for a period of time, then reappearing in a different location. The traveling sink stopper was a frequent puzzler. Doors at the Scott residence were another anomaly, opening and closing by themselves, and the electrical system seemed to function independently as well. On one occasion, Joel and his wife were visiting their neighbors. When they happened to glance out the window across the street, lights were going on and off in various rooms of their own house. They rushed home immediately, only to find everything as they had left it. The house was empty, and the only burning lights were those that they had left on before going out. It was also impossible to explain the drastic temperature drop in one particular part of the bathroom. The cold column was a 2 to 3 foot square area that extended from floor to ceiling. Tested with a thermometer, it appeared to be colder than the rest of the bathroom by approximately 10 degrees Celsius. The phenomenon only took place on certain days, however making it difficult to account for in any rational manner. Somehow the unexplainable events of the Scott household became public knowledge. Jewel and his wife began losing their privacy as their home became a local curiosity. Showing no respect for the occupants of the haunted house, ghost hunters frequently trampled flower beds and peered in the windows. Strangers showed up at all hours wanting to take pictures and hoping to see a ghost. One couple even offered the Scotts $200 for the opportunity to stay overnight in their home. Sensing this kind of financial opportunity, profiters came out of the woodwork. Jewel reported receiving letters from a number of mystics, parapsychologists, and psychic phenomena experts. Some showed legitimate professional interest. Others clearly wanted to make a quick exploitive buck. The publicity even prompted a local radio personality to interview Jewel in his home, in the hopes that some supernatural noises would be evident on the tape. None were. Jewel Scott may have been inconvenienced and annoyed by the public's fascination, but he understood it completely. After having lived in the house a few months, he was completely intrigued by the secrets it held. In the August 25, 1979 edition of the Regina Leader-Post, he told reporter Bruce Johnstone that he found himself becoming infatuated with the house and its strange events. In fact, he became so obsessed with telling friends and acquaintances each new discovery about the house's horrible history. He admitted later, "I realize now people must have thought I was crazy." Crazy or not, Jewel Scott began to piece together a pattern of tragedy in connection with his home. In 1973 or 74, a young girl who lived in the house had collapsed and died of a seizure in the upstairs bathroom. Her prone body was discovered in the spot where the cold column later existed. The next unlucky tenants were Saskatchewan's Deputy Minister of Social Services, Hubert A. Prefontaine, and his family. As well as being a popular politician, Prefontaine was a skilled pilot, and at 8:45 p.m. on January 22, 1975, he left St. Andrew's Satellite Field of the Winnipeg Airport in a single-engine Piper Cherokee. 1 hour later, Prefontaine made his last radio contact when he routinely requested clearance through the Brandon control area. Another hour after that, when the plane did not arrive in Regina as expected, the Canadian Armed Forces Search and Rescue Unit in Edmonton was contacted. The next morning, George Fuller, a CP Rail signal maintainer at Balgonie, discovered the wreckage. Hubert Prefontaine and his wife Carol were both dead. Miraculously, their two youngest daughters, aged 1.5 and 4 years, survived the crash and a night of sub-zero temperatures with minor injuries. 4 older daughters had not been with their parents on that fateful night. According to the newspaper reports, they heard the horrible news at the family home on College Avenue. In his Leader Post interview, Jewel Scott intimated that there were another 2 deaths connected to the house and that the circumstances were unusual and mysterious. It is not known if he discovered any more details on past tenants, but one thing is certain. The newest casualty in the College Avenue house was to be the Scotts' marriage. The first year of marriage is often difficult, and Jewel Scott and his wife surely dealt with some additional stresses, then unwillingly sacrificed a great deal of privacy. When the publicity was at its peak, Jewel's wife didn't share his news and intense interest in the house and the unusual phenomenon. And finally, there is the possibility that the couple's relationship may have been sabotaged directly by supernatural forces in the house. Jewel Scott contradicted himself interestingly when describing the disintegration of his marriage. The stress and the tension of the marriage breaking down may have caused some of the kinetic energy in the house, he said at one time, paradoxically adding later that the mysterious happenings in the house definitely contributed to the downfall of the marriage. Whether they created the negative energy in the house or fell victim to it, the Scotts were heading for divorce court when they left the College Avenue house in May of 1977. Once he had distanced himself from the house, Joel began to wonder if there weren't rational explanations for much of what he experienced. The 40-year-old wiring might have accounted for some flickering lights, and perhaps the settling foundation of such an old structure could explain the odd closing door. For many, however, it is easier to believe in ghosts than in Joel Scott's eventual theory that mysteriously disappearing or moving objects were the work of a mischievous neighborhood child, who either had availed himself of a key or snuck in secretly through the coal chute. Even years later, when Joel Scott was attempting to pin natural explanations to each seemingly supernatural occurrence, he admitted that in many cases it seemed impossible. He also spoke to the leader post of the intangible dread the house gave him, claiming that it had bad vibes and cursed its occupants with bad luck. Despite these negative associations, when Joel left the College Avenue house, he took with him a small souvenir. It was the bathroom sink stopper, and in Joel Scott's new home, it stayed put. This story takes place at Knossi Lake. Mystery at the Moosehead. One of the first strange things to happened to Jeff Stephen. He was at the time manager of the Moosehead Inn in Knossi Lake. Jeff needed to replace one of the bottles at the bar and had gone downstairs through the darkened restaurant to the small room where the liquor was stored. Dale Orsted, the owner, was giving me a tour of the restaurant as he shared the story. The porthole, which it's obviously nautical themed, is nestled in the lower floor of the 3-story building. The heavy wood decor is enchanted dramatically by the fact that there is no natural light in the room. Jeff's experience was very likely heightened by the same fact. For when the restaurant is closed and the switch is turned off, not a ray of light penetrates the dark. We don't always bother to turn on the lights, Dale explained, because we know where everything is in here. We could find our way around blindfolded. This is what Jeff was doing, weaving defeatedly between the tables in a completely darkened room when he reached the liquor storage area on the opposite side. However, he needed to see the labels on the bottles. He reached around the doorway, feeling the wall for the light switch. That's when something felt him. Later, Jeff described it as a cold hand that touched his wrist and ran lightly up his arm. The sensation rattled him so thoroughly, he forgot the task at hand and hastened back across the pitch-black restaurant and upstairs to the nightclub. He arrived back at the bar, refusing to explain why he hadn't brought the necessary bottle, and unwilling to make another trip. Dale now recalls that it was a couple of weeks before Jeff even spoke of his experience. At that, he found the incident so unsettling, he didn't want to talk about it much. Ironically, unsettling incidents were soon to become the number one topic of discussion at this popular nightclub. Originally, it was Granson Hall, a teen dance club built in the 1968 by Archibald Granson and his wife. It was a late-in-life project for this couple. They were in their 60s when they began. By the time Dale Orsted was old enough to attend teen dances at Knossi Lake, most happening establishment, Grandy and his wife were well into their 70s. According to Dale, it didn't stop them from enjoying what they did. The place was big-time popular, and they'd almost with canes, walk up the stage and thank everybody for coming out. And all of the best bands were here, Streetheart and Harlequin and Loverboy. Anyone that was big, and they had them here for their dances. Unfortunately, Mr. Grandison's health began failing by 1978, and the hall was sold in March of the following year. eventually renamed the Moosehead Inn. The establishment changed hands throughout the 80s. In 1989, the Moosehead was once again for sale, and this time Dale Orsted was the prospective buyer. Having always lived in the area, Dale knew that this was a successful business. He was also fairly sure that a few changes could make it even more successful. The sale went ahead, and Dale took possession in March of 1990. The 3 floors of the Moosehead Inn seemed to meet all of Dale's business and personal needs. The first floor was a cozy dining room, the second floor a cabaret, and the third floor provided office space, and a conveniently functional, if somewhat cramped apartment. Dale moved in, made himself comfortable, and commenced work. Renovations started on the second floor in the nightclub, hoping to update the look of the place. Dale had new bars built and changed the locations of the DJ booth. Almost immediately thereafter, the confusing incidents began. Things would go missing, said Dale, and come back 2 or 3 weeks later to the same spot. I'd have people looking for the stuff and know it wasn't there. And noises. I sit up here in the apartment and hear almost a banging, like someone was trying to break in. Only we'd listen for an hour and a half, so he was a pretty slow burglar if he was coming in. Dale was often certain that there was a burglar in the club. However, on several occasions he was convinced enough to phone the police. They'd come and check every inch out and find nothing, he said. Then it might happen again after they'd leave. Dale was worried enough to call the police at least 4 or 5 times, he said, adding, every time they'd come, they've got their guns out looking for the bad guys, and then you'd feel stupid. Embarrassment didn't stop Dale from taking extra security measures. The missing items in the club had him speculating that one of the previous owner's employees had a set of keys. So every lock in the building was replaced. The continuing late-night noises prompted him to install security cameras and motion detectors. Every precaution had been taken, yet nothing changed. Items still went missing. Dale and his girlfriend were still awakened by loud banging noises coming from the cabaret. Eventually, they began to suspect that they weren't dealing with entirely earthly matters. One time, he said, we had a phone book out calling the police, and a gust of wind blew the pages of the phone book shut. The call was eventually made, and as usual, the police found nothing out of the ordinary. Dale's girlfriend might have reported differently, though. She was in the apartment when loud footsteps on the stairs had her thinking that Dale was bringing the officers up to talk to her. In fact, Dale and the police were outside, searching in vain for some footprints in the fresh snow, while the door at the bottom of the stairway remained securely locked. On another evening, Dale captured the disturbing sounds on one of his surveillance videotapes. It was definitely inside the building, he said of the noise, adding, it was more like an energy bang, like when a bubble bursts or a balloon pops. Dale saved the tape, but was unable to find it later. The noises eventually went away, and if small items were found missing, it happened so infrequently that it was easily dismissed as human forgetfulness. Business was good, and life at the Moosehead Inn became calm. It was a brief respite. In February of 1992, Dale decided to remove the old carpeting from the cabaret floor. It was frayed and worn, probably as old as the building, and it needed to go. Dale and Jeff put in a late night ripping the old rug from the floorboards, then retired to the apartment at 4 a.m. They were shocked into consciousness. Dale, Jeff, and Dale's girlfriend all awoke to violent crashing noises coming from the floor below. With no idea of what they might face, Dale and Jeff bravely ventured downstairs to investigate. Jeff insured himself by carrying a length of steel pipe but didn't need it. For once the two men were in the nightclub, the sounds stopped. The minute they settled back into the apartment, however, it began again. Loud as a car crash, in Jeff's words. It was a frustrating cycle that was to continue every night for the next 2 weeks, and sporadically for months. When the deafening noises resumed, other unexplainable things began to happen as well. The Moosehead's newly installed motion detector was tripped when no one was in the building. The dishwasher by the bar once turned itself on for approximately 10 seconds, when no one had touched it. And several times in the early morning hours, when the club was closed and staff members were relaxing with a drink, steel doors outfitted with emergency panic hardware would fly open with a huge bang, then just as alarmingly slam shut, according to Dale. It was an effective way to empty a room. Usually, he notes dryly, people are gone. 2 minutes later, the electric lights also act autonomously. Dale and Jeff would routinely turn off all the cabaret lights at the end of the evening and return later to find that some had been switched back on. One time, Dale had just taken care of this task and barely turned his back when he heard the light switch click into position behind him. He turned around to see the bar lights that he'd just shut off glowing defiantly. What Dale Orsted refers to as his most frightening experience at the Moosehead Inn happened on February of '92, on the evening the carpet renovations were complete. We were sitting here in the apartment watching TV. From the adjoining room, suddenly there was a very eerie moaning sound. It sounded as if someone was in extreme pain and lasted for about 10 seconds. We just sat there pretending we didn't hear it. I was scared, and my girlfriend, you could see her eyes just popping out. But we didn't mention a word until later that night. Around 4 o'clock the next morning, after Dale and his girlfriend managed to get to sleep, the activity resumed. Again, it was a crashing noise, as loud and violent as a head-on collision. But this incident differed. All the previous noises had come from the nightclub downstairs. This one seemed to be right outside the apartment door. The sound created enough physical impact to break dishes that were sitting in the kitchen sink. The faucet turned on by itself, and water began gushing down the drain. Dale and his girlfriend spent several hours shaking in fright and waiting for the sun to rise. When it did, she moved out. On February 1st, 1992, the Winnipeg Free Press carried an advertisement that read, "Haunted Houses Investigated. 10 years experience." The ad sparked the curiosity of a reporter who followed up with a story in the Winnipeg Sun. That same story was picked up by a Saskatchewan paper and read with great interest by Dale Orsted's girlfriend. The original ad had been placed by Roy Boyer and Chris Rukowski of Spectre Paranormal Investigations. The young woman knew that Dale was near the end of his rope, and he had talked to simply walking away from the business. Thinking that this might be the kind of help he needed, she called the number and ended up talking to Roy Bauer about her experiences at the Moosehead. Bauer seemed interested in the case, and he was not alone. When he visited the Moosehead Inn in May, he had a reporter and film crew from CBC's news magazine in tow. The Regina Leader Post had recently run a story on the Moosehead, and now it seemed that everyone wanted to know what was haunting this popular club. From a little investigation of his own, Dale thought he might know. He believed that the second floor of the building had originally been part of an old country church near Kipling. There were rumors that decades earlier, a priest had hanged himself in his bell tower. Roy Bauer dismissed the idea after discovering that the building material in question came not from the church itself, but from a nearby community hall that belonged to the church. That left him looking for another ghostly suspect, and he settled on Archibald Grancion's Bauer interviewed Mr. Granson's in front of CBC's camera and began to formulate a theory. His feeling was that Granson Hall had been a major accomplishment for Archibald, particularly since he had taken the project on so late in life. His sudden decline in health hadn't allowed him to give the hall up gradually, and so after his death in 1983, his spirit was drawn back here. For years he caused no problems. Then came Dale Orsted's renovations. Roy Bauer speculated that Mr. Granson's didn't appreciate seeing his hard work torn apart by strangers, and began making his presence known. In a follow-up report to Dale and Jeff, Bauer suggested that they reconsider making any major renovations in the future, unless the phenomenon had stopped completely. Bauer also suggested the playing of a customed audio tape in which he would attempt to communicate with Mr. Granson. 3 weeks later, in another correspondence, he offered a more drastic piece of advice. I strongly feel that if the audio tape does not work, he wrote, the only way you'll be able to get rid of the problem is by tearing down the inn and rebuilding it from scratch. Dale Orsted had yet to be completely convinced, however, that the ghost was Mr. Granson. A bit more of his own research had revealed some other interesting possibilities. It turned out there had been a terrible car accident some years earlier where 2 or 3 people were killed on their way home from the hall. Dale noted that with interest, reminded of how so many of the unexplained noises sounded like a violent head-on collision. Supernatural stories connected to the church continued to find their way to Dale as well. There are rumors of people dying unexpectedly just a short time after visiting the church, according to legend. Vehicles would stall on the road that ran in front of it, refusing to restart until they were pushed past the churchyard. People claimed that the building glowed eerily at night and that some visitors returned to their vehicle to discover a freshly cut rose laying on the seat. The most likely suspect, however, was far less dramatic. When Dale learned of a quiet man who had been associated with the Moosehead Inn in the 80s and allegedly died believing that his contribution to the business had not been appreciated, he sensed that he may have found his ghost. Strengthening Dale's theory was a list of clues provided by a Winnipeg psychic. The woman had never been to the Moosehead, but provided pages of information about the spirit that roamed the cabaret, and about the building itself. Her impressions of the inn and its contents were so accurate that it lent credibility to her description of the ghost. And her description of the ghost was more of a custom fit for Dale's suspect than it was for Archibald Granson. For most people, however, the identity of the ghost was of considerably less interest than the validity of it. Although Dale had never actively sought any of the media attention, some people, including reporters he had been kind enough to cooperate with, were cynically suggesting that his stories were nothing more than a publicity stunt. Dale scoffed at the idea, saying that the Moosehead Inn was thriving before the rumor got out. I don't think it brought us business because we were always busy. It just changed the type of questions that the staff got, he explained, adding that after a point it was a hindrance. It got so that every 2 minutes there was somebody else wanting to talk about it. In an effort to answer their questions, he began printing his daily restaurant specials on the reverse side of the photocopied ghost story, and in the spirit of fun, the nightclub was staffed by ghost bouncers. But Dale insisted that if he had created a gimmick, he would have created one that was easier to live with. A lot of people thought it was a good promotion scam, he said, shaking his head. But 4 o'clock in the morning, I didn't think so. His detractors should have noted that for some time Dale chose to commute from distance Estevan rather than live with what they referred to as his publicity stunt. There were also skeptics who, never doubting Dale Orsted's integrity, had a hard time believing his supernatural explanations. Non-believing staff members, however, almost always changed their minds after having a strange experience or two. One of the coverts, a kitchen worker, was interviewed for CBC's news magazine. He claimed to have been skeptical about the ghost until he witnessed the heavy kitchen cooler door, usually kept in place by a latch and air pressure, open and close on its own. "It's hard not to say you believe in ghosts," he exclaims. "I mean, the cooler opened and shut, and there's no way the cooler can open and shut. I was there." According to Dale Orsted, most staff members have encountered an entity at one time or another, and you can tell if they're telling the truth, he said. Ones that just want to jump on the bandwagon, they don't have the same look in their eyes. When someone's just had an experience, you look in their eyes and there's fear. One young woman who worked for Dale claimed no fear of ghosts. She, her mother, and her grandmother all had some degree of psychic ability, and the entire family was very accepting of paranormal activity. Still, she was notably distressed after one experience in the nightclub. "This was late at night, and we were closed," said Dale. "Now it seems to hang out in the girls' bathroom. And this girl was in there all by herself. Suddenly all the doors on the stalls were banging open and close, and all the toilets started flushing. When we got back, she was just shaking in the corner waiting for us." Dale added that if it happened once, you'd maybe doubt it, but we've had 3 or 4 girls say the same story. Recently, the activity tends to be much less dramatic. For a special long weekend event, Dale and Jeff temporarily moved the bars into the center of the nightclub, creating a stand-up area. A week later, the downstairs restaurant was still plagued by the phantom sounds of furniture being dragged across the floor above. Deadbolts that had been slid into position are occasionally found unlocked. These days, and every once in a while, Dale will hear the doorknob to his apartment turn slightly as if someone's testing it from the other side. These events would be more than enough to frighten most people, but after what Dale Orsted has experienced, this is a state of calm. While there's no doubt that he prefers it, he does have a strange reason for missing the phenomenon. You tend to want it to come back, because after you're away from it for a while, you start to doubt yourself again. When it's happening, you're sure that nothing's ever going to let you forget that it happened. But after a while, you just want to get reinforced. If there is some part of Dale that wishes for a repeat performance, there is a more sensible part of him that certainly does not. His current schedule confirms that. He takes his time with the closing duties these days. After everyone's left the club, he has a nightcap and putters around. By the time he goes to bed, it's dawn, and the window of opportunity for any supernatural activity has passed. But avoidance wasn't always so easy. When I first moved here, there was no TV after midnight. But now there is one 24-hour channel, Yorkton. Before I'd go to bed, turn the show on, turn it up loud, and try to cover whatever was happening. If anything does happen, Dale is now dealing with it on his own. His girlfriend never did move back in. Jeff Stephen, Dale's longtime manager and friend, recently married and left the business entirely. So after a period of several months, when absolutely no one would risk living in the Moosehead's 3rd-floor apartment, Dale moved back in by himself. Imagine him alone late at night with the television on, listening and waiting. It's really just another classic tale of things that go bump in the nightclub. This story takes place in Rockglen, Saskatchewan. A ghost in Rockglen. Amy recalls that her first uncomfortable incident in the house happened the first winter after she and Garth moved in. There was a veranda on the front of the house that had been closed in to make an extra room. That was where we kept the washer and dryer, right beside the doorway that led to the basement, Amy told me. The doorway to the basement was in fact little more than a hole in the floor that had been covered by a board. On this particular day, as Amy transferred the wet laundry from the washer to the dryer, the board was slightly out of place, leaving an opening. I had this feeling, she told me, that something was tugging on my pant leg. I thought maybe it was caught on a nail, so I just gave my leg a shake. The moment she stopped moving, however, the sensation returned. Somewhat nonplussed, she hurriedly finished her chore and left the veranda room. Once in another part of the house, the eerie feeling disappeared, and so soon after did Amy's concern. She even forgot to mention the strange incident to Garth, and might have forgotten entirely had she not been reminded days later. She was reminded when Garth described having had the identical experience. It was spooky, but the Harrisons did their best to explain such things away. Even when they couldn't, the most unsettling experiences would eventually fade into memory and lose their frightening power. And certainly Amy and Garth had other things on their mind. 2 years after moving into the house, the Harrisons welcomed their first child, Dusty. A year later, twins, Tessa and Tanya, followed. Many experts in the field of parapsychology agree that children who do not yet hold socialized beliefs of what is and isn't possible tend to be more sensitive to the unusual phenomenon. Because of the perceptiveness, youngsters may even have a catalytic influence on supernatural activity. Indeed, Amy estimates that things really started to happen when the twins were about 18 months old. Tessa and Tanya would frequently awaken, sobbing in the middle of the night. Dusty began to suffer from graphic nightmares. The children began telling Amy and Garth that they saw red eyes staring at them from their bedroom window, and that sometimes there was someone in the bedroom with them. Dusty would frantically point at the person in an effort to convince his parents, but Amy and Garth could see no one. The events may have been chalked up to childish imagination, but the elder Harrisons were having strange and frightening experiences of their own. The television began switching on and off, sans human intervention. Amy had the distinct feeling she was being watched every day at 5 p.m. as she fixed the family's dinner. Garth, who liked to listen to the stereo while he showered, could not explain how the volume would adjust itself wildly when he was the only person in the house. On one occasion, Garth was shaving in the bathroom when he glanced into the mirror and saw a bath towel flying toward the back of his head. Terrified, he spun around in time to see 2 more coming at him. Understandably, he left the house in a hurry. Admirably, he found the courage to eventually return. Garth was also plagued by phantom sounds, footsteps, and the voice of an elderly man calling out to him. Each room he would follow the voice into would be predictably empty, however. It was Amy who finally managed to see the presence. Late one night, as she went up to check on her children, it was the gray shape of a man, she said. He appeared to her to be tall and thin, with his feet spread and his hands on his hip. The apparition disappeared in front of Amy's astonished eyes, but not all at once. He faded away gradually, top to bottom, starting with his head and ending with his feet. Frightened and at their wits' end, the Harrisons consulted a psychic. Without having seen their house, the woman was able to describe it perfectly. She also sensed a bit of unsavory history in connection with the building. Apparently, a murder had taken place in the basement. Amy and Garth never researched the psychic's claim, but they were very willing to take her advice regarding leaving the house. They started to make plans to move into a trailer on the same lot. In November of 1986, they were ready to make the change, but not without taking some solemn precautions. The Harrisons had a Catholic priest come out first to bless the trailer, using salt and holy water, then to bless each room in the newly vacant house, including the basement. Garth's one final preventative measure was to tear the house down and burn the remains. And so they thought it had ended. The Harrisons breathed a sigh of relief and began enjoying a peaceful life in their new home, feeling quite confident that the events had become history. They even shared their story with a reporter from the Saskatoon Star-Phoenix for a Halloween edition. That story resulted in a phone call from a Saskatchewan woman who recommended saying special prayers to keep the entity out of their new home. Amy politely thanked her for the advice, sure she would never need to use it. She was wrong. Soon after the article appeared, Amy began hearing footsteps again, this time in the loft of the barn. The noises were accompanied by the familiar feeling that someone was there. Something not good. She believed it to be the same unfriendly spirit that haunted the house. It's still around, she said. It just moved to a different building. And fortunately, that's where it remains. Amy has heeded the Saskatoon woman's advice, saying specific prayers to keep the Harrison home safe. It seems to be working, and most importantly, has given Amy a sense of being able to protect her family from otherworldly threats. Hopefully in the future, the Harrison home in Rockglen will remain as peaceful as it looks.